There are secrets that are not buried underground. They live in broad daylight. They breathe the same air as we do. But they are protected by a wall higher than any man can build. The wall of silence. A silence built with fear, brick by brick, generation after generation. In the mountains of Guerrero, poverty has a particular sound. It is the sound of the wind whistling through the sheets of tin that cover the houses. The cry of a child that no one hears. The rumbling of an empty stomach. The echo of a promise broken by a politician on the campaign trail. But there are silences that are deeper, heavier. Silences that hold stories the mind refuses to process. Stories that, once heard, stick to your soul like soot. They stay with you forever. I am Mateo Del Valle, and this is Realidad Prohibida. Today, I am not asking you to subscribe for me, or for the channel. That is not important. I'm asking you to subscribe to lend your voice to those who had theirs stolen. To lend your eyes to a truth that the world refuses to see. To be the cry that breaks a century of muffled whispers. Because the story you are about to hear is not a legend. It is not a horror story to scare children around the campfire. It is the chronicle of a blood pact sealed in desperation. Of an unwritten law that condemned 5 generations to look at themselves in the same broken mirror. A lineage forced to love the same blood, to desire the same face, to perpetuate a mistake until it became an inescapable destiny. This is the story of the Almonte women, the matriarchs of a clan lost in the Cerro del Silencio, and the secret that made them the most incestuous women in Guerrero. The journey into horror rarely begins with a scream. It begins with a whisper, with an anomaly on a page. For Dr. Ricardo Fuentes, the whisper came in the form of a medical file, a manila folder stained with coffee. Inside, a single sheet of paper. 6-year-old boy. Name, Angel Almonte. Diagnosis, polydactyly, syndactyly, cleft lip, cleft palate, and a heart murmur so loud it could be heard without a stethoscope, like a bird trapped flapping inside a cardboard box. Ricardo was young. Too young, perhaps. He had just arrived at the rural clinic in Zoquistlahuaca for his social service. A mandatory year of exile in oblivion, as his colleagues in the city called it. But Ricardo didn't see it that way. He arrived full of that pure arrogance that only youth and science can give. He believed he could cure the world, or at least that little forgotten corner of the Guerrero Mountains. He arrived with his new stethoscope and his textbook still fresh in his memory, ready to be the hero of a story that no one would ever write. The boy, Angel, arrived in his mother's arms. She was a young woman, no more than 20 years old, although her eyes seemed to be 100. They didn't look at Ricardo. They looked through him, empty, opaque. She spoke in monosyllables, her voice barely a whisper. He fell. He has a fever. He won't eat. Ricardo took the child. His little body was a map of genetic errors. Extra fingers on his hands and feet, some functional, others just flaps of skin. Other fingers were fused together as if nature hadn't had time to finish the job. His spine curved at an impossible angle. But it was his face that made the doctor's blood run cold. He had the same eyes as his mother. Exactly the same. The same receding jaw. The same strange shape of the left ear, slightly lower than the right. Ricardo had seen similar photographs in his thick genetics textbook. In a chapter that many teachers skipped. Markers of severe inbreeding. The result of repeated crossbreeding. Over and over again. He felt a professional chill, an academic curiosity. He didn't yet understand the horror. He only saw the science. "Ma'am," he said in the softest, most professional tone he could muster. "Are there other cases like your son's in the family? Cousins, siblings, with similar problems?" The woman looked at him for the first time, and in her eyes there was no sadness, no fear, no shame. There was something worse. Acceptance. A resignation so deep that it seemed like a geological feature of her face. "We are all like this," she replied, her voice as flat as dry earth. "It's in the blood." The phrase was not an excuse, nor was it an explanation. It was a sentence, a statement of principles. That night, Ricardo couldn't sleep. The lights in the clinic hummed. The chirping of a lone cricket seemed to pierce the silence. The phrase echoed off the walls of his small, damp room. "It's the blood. It's the blood." He got up and consulted his books. He searched the internet with a terrible satellite signal. Inbreeding, genetic recessiveness, family trees collapsing in on themselves. The theory was fascinating. But the reality was a young woman with dead eyes and a child whose body was a silent scream. The next morning, he asked the local nurse, Doña Elia, a woman who had seen 3 generations born and die in that valley. Her hands knew more secrets than any confessional. "The Almontes?" Elia stopped folding gauze. She crossed herself. A quick, almost imperceptible gesture. "We don't talk about them, doctor." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They're from Cerro del Silencio. They live up there. Way up there. No one goes up there. They don't come down." She paused, looking out the window at the peaks shrouded in fog, only when death is already at their heels. Like that little angel. But why? What's wrong with them? Ricardo insisted. Doña Elia shook her head. "They're different. They have their own rules. They take care of each other. They marry among themselves. It's always been that way. It's best to leave them alone. There are doors that shouldn't be opened, doctor." The nurse's words, instead of dissuading him, lit a fuse in Ricardo. His academic curiosity was transforming. It was becoming an obsession. What was that place? What kind of family isolated itself from the world in such a way, to the point of genetic self-destruction? The system, the bureaucracy, the official indifference. They hadn't entered his radar yet. He still believed in direct action, in the power of a good man to do the right thing. He grabbed his medical bag, 2 bottles of water, some granola bars, and a determination that bordered on madness. He decided to climb the hill of silence. He decided to ignore the warnings. He decided to enter the lion's den. The road was not on any map. It was a path that was washed away by the rain and rebuilt by barefoot footsteps, a scar on the mountainside. As he climbed, the sound of the valley disappeared. The bird song faded. The noise of distant engines vanished. The air became thick and heavy, laden with something more than humidity. It was as if the hill itself was holding its breath, guarding its secret. After 2 hours of brutal climbing, he saw it. It wasn't a village, not even a hamlet. It was a small complex, several adobe and tin huts arranged in an imperfect circle, like a primitive fortress, like a refugee camp from a world that no longer existed. Smoke from a single campfire rose languidly into the sky. A skeletal dog, its fur matted to its ribs, barked once. A hoarse bark without conviction. Then it hid under one of the huts, whimpering. The silence that followed was absolute. Total. Ricardo felt a cold that was not due to the altitude. It was the cold of abandonment. The cold of a place that time had forgotten. He stood at the entrance to the circle of huts. His heart was pounding in his ears. He waited. No one came out. But he felt like he was being watched. From the dark slits that served as windows. From the shadows of the half-open doors, dozens of eyes. "I'm a doctor," he said aloud. His own voice sounded strange, invasive, a desecration. "I'm from the clinic. I've come to help." Silence. Only the wind whistling softly. He repeated his words, this time louder. "I examined a child. Angel. I want to see if his family needs anything." The door of the largest hut, in the center of the circle, opened with a long, painful creak. An elderly woman appeared in the doorway. She moved with a majestic slowness. Her face was a mask of deep wrinkles, like a map of dry, cracked terrain. Her eyes, small and bright, like pieces of obsidian, pierced him. They weren't assessing him. They were sentencing him. She wasn't the boy's grandmother. Ricardo understood immediately. She was the matriarch, the queen of this kingdom of dust and pain. "We don't need help here," said the woman. Her voice was like the rustling of dry leaves, strong, definitive. "All we need here is to be left alone." Behind her, in the shadows of the hut, shadows moved. Ricardo strained his eyes, adjusting to the darkness, and his soul was torn in two. They weren't shadows. They were people, children, teenagers, adults, sitting on the dirt floor, leaning against the adobe walls, and all of them. Absolutely all of them. They had the same face. It was like looking at an echo. A worn, distorted photocopy, repeated over and over again with less and less ink. The same broad forehead, the same sunken, close-set eyes, the same twisted mouth, the same weak lower jaw. A young man stared at him from a corner. His head was tilted at a permanent angle, his neck unable to hold it upright. One of his hands had only 3 fingers, long and thin like a bird's. A little girl, perhaps 4 years old, cradled by a woman who could be her sister or her aunt or her mother or all of them at once, had a cleft that split her face from her nose to her lip. She wasn't crying. No one made a sound. They just stared. With the same empty, resigned expression Ricardo had seen on Angel's mother. The air inside the hut was stifling. It smelled of stale sweat, of untreated disease, of damp wood, of urine, and something else, something metallic and sweet. The smell of shared blood, too shared. Ricardo took a step back. His stomach churned. He felt the sour taste of bile in his throat. He wanted to vomit. He wanted to run. His academic knowledge of genetics, the cold tables and diagrams in his books, shattered against the brutal, living, suffering reality before him. This was not a case study. It was hell on earth. A biological prison built by themselves, generation after generation. The old woman smiled, a toothless smile that didn't reach her eyes, a grimace of macabre triumph. "You see, Doctor, we're fine. We are the Almontes. Our blood is strong. Our blood is pure." Ricardo felt his legs give way beneath him. Cold sweat ran down his back, soaking his shirt. A high-pitched buzzing filled his ears, drowning out all other sounds. He leaned against the adobe doorframe. It was cold and rough against the palm of his hand. He focused on that sensation, the cold, the roughness, so he wouldn't faint, so he wouldn't scream. His gaze swept across the interior of the hut again. And then he saw her. In a corner, oblivious to the rest. a very young couple shared a knowing silence. The girl, barely 16, had a premature maturity about her, the calmness of someone who holds a deep secret. Next to her, the young man, not much older than her, rested his hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was both an anchor and a refuge. United by the same dark hair, their gazes were lost on a horizon that only they seemed to be contemplating. The same thin upper lip. He could be her brother, or her cousin, or her uncle, or her father. Ricardo understood the magnitude of the tragedy. This was no accident. It was not ignorance. It was a law, a sacred and monstrous tradition. "Who are you?" Ricardo asked, his voice a whisper, addressing the old woman. The woman who had taken Angel to the clinic, the boy's mother, replied from the back of the hut. Her voice was lifeless. "She's my grandmother, Soledad." She paused. "And she's my mother's mother." Another pause. "And she's also my aunt." The air escaped from Ricardo's lungs. The Almonte family tree had no branches. It was a circle, a knot that tightened more and more with each generation, strangling the genetic code, squeezing the life and health out of their own descendants. The matriarch, Soledad, looked at him with a kind of twisted pride, like a prophet of a deranged religion. "The first was my great-grandmother, Eulalia. She gave us the law." The story poured out, not as a confession, but as a sermon. Like the gospel of the clan, Eulalia Almonte. More than a century ago. The violence of the revolution, chaos, a local chieftain stole her land, with false papers and armed men. A stranger, a soldier, stole her honor on a dark night. Abandoned, betrayed, and humiliated by outsiders, by the others, Eulalia made an oath. A blood oath. Her lineage would never again mix with the poison of the outside world. Her family would be an island, a fortress of blood and earth. "The blood of the Almontes is only for the Almontes," recited Soledad, and other women in the hut murmured the phrase as if it were a creed. That's how it stays strong. That way, no one betrays us. That way, the poison from outside doesn't touch us. Ricardo looked at her, incredulous. Anger began to replace shock. "Strong?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Don't you see your children, your grandchildren? They're dying. Your blood isn't strong. It's poisoned by you." Soledad shrugged. Her indifference was as vast as the sky. "It's the price," she said simply. "Some are born weak, crooked. It's the will of God and the blood. A test, the strong survive, and they carry on the bloodline. The law is fulfilled. For them, children with deformities were not a tragedy. They were a tribute, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of their self-imposed purity, an offering to the memory of Eulalia and her insane law." Ricardo stumbled out of the hut, walking backwards. He couldn't turn his back on them. The afternoon sun seemed obscene, too bright for the horror he had just witnessed in the shadows. He ran down the hill, tripping over roots and stones. He didn't feel the pain from the scrapes on his legs or the burning in his lungs. He felt only a primal urgency, a desperate need to do something, to break that circle, to stop that factory of pain. At that moment, Ricardo Fuentes still believed in the system. He believed that if he showed the horror, the world would react. How naive he was, how terribly young. His first destination was the municipal palace of Xochitlahuaca, a concrete building painted a faded peach color. The mayor, a robust man with a thick mustache and a linen shirt that struggled to contain his belly, listened impatiently. His attention was divided between Ricardo and and the plans for the patron saint festival stage. Ricardo spoke quickly, his voice broken by agitation and the rush. He described the children, the deformities, the isolation, the systematic incest. The mayor sighed, a long theatrical sigh, as if he were being told about an insignificant problem. "Look, doctor," he said, leaning over his worn wooden desk. "With all due respect, they're the Almontes." He pronounced the name as if it explained everything. "They've always been there. They've always been strange." He waved his hand. "It's their customs, you understand. Here in the mountains, we are very respectful of the customs of the indigenous communities. The law requires us to be." Ricardo felt a wave of hot rage rise in his throat. "They're not customs. They're crimes. It's systematic child abuse. Those children are suffering, dying." The president leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. "And who has complained? Old Soledad? Have any of them come down to file a complaint? No, right?" He paused, looking at Ricardo as if he were a silly, idealistic child. "Don't get involved, doctor. Take care of the coughs and diarrhea of the people down here. Leave the people on the hill alone. Don't look for trouble where there isn't any." Ricardo stood in the middle of the office, the smell of stale coffee and old papers, the buzzing of a fly trapped against a dirty window. He felt the first crack in his faith, the cold, heavy wall of indifference. He didn't give up. He thought he needed a higher authority. He went to the small police station. A single officer, dozing in a plastic chair, attended to him. He listened to Ricardo's story without changing his expression. When Ricardo finished, the policeman stretched, yawned. "That sounds like something for the DIF, doctor, or the Human Rights Commission. We deal with theft, drunks." "What you're talking about? That's a family matter. A very, very family matter. We can't go into people's homes and tell them who to marry." Another closed door. Ricardo felt the walls closing in around him. The next day, he took the first bus to Chilpancingo, the state capital. He was going higher up. To the state DIF, the System for Integral Family Development. The name itself sounded like a promise. Development, integral, family. The DIF building was a maze of gray corridors and identical doors. The air conditioning hummed, creating an artificial cold that contrasted with the suffocating heat of the street. After an hour and a half of waiting in an orange plastic chair, he was received by an official. Ms. Morales, a middle-aged woman with an impeccable tailored suit, a stiff hairstyle, and an expression of chronic boredom. Ricardo told the story once again, this time more calmly, trying to sound objective and professional. He took out the photos he had taken with his cell phone. They were blurry, taken surreptitiously. Angel's face, the young man's hand with 3 fingers, a general view of the shanty town. Ms. Morales looked at the photos without blinking. She showed no surprise, no horror, no compassion. She pushed them aside on her desk as if they were meaningless postcards. "I understand your concern, doctor," she said, her voice flat. It was the voice of an answering machine. "But in order for us to intervene, we need to follow a strict protocol." She opened a drawer and took out a stack of papers. "First, you need to fill out the Family Vulnerability Report Form, 34B. Then, the Socioeconomic Census, which is F12. We also need an official report from a certified social worker who visits the home and conducts a field study." "I'm the doctor. I was there. I'm telling you." Desperation colored his voice. Morales looked at him over her glasses. A cold, bureaucratic stare. Your testimony is valuable, Doctor. But it's anecdotal. The system requires documented and classified evidence. Without the correct forms, I can't even open a file. As far as the system is concerned, this family does not officially exist. She pointed to the pile of papers. Fill this out. Make 3 copies. Attach a copy of your professional license and your social service appointment, and come back. The case reception window closes at 3. Ricardo looked at the papers. They were a wall of bureaucratic jargon. Questions about income, education, type of flooring in the home, access to public services, number of light bulbs in the house. Useless, absurd questions for a family that lived outside of time and the law. He felt deeply nauseous. The horror he had seen was being translated, reduced, turned into boxes to check and spaces to fill in. The system didn't want to understand. It wanted to classify, to file the pain away in a manila folder. He took the papers. His hands trembled slightly with pure frustration. He left feeling dirty, complicit. He spent the next 2 weeks obsessed. He filled out the forms as best he could, making up answers he didn't have. He convinced a social worker from a neighboring town to accompany him, paying her out of his own pocket. Together, they climbed the hill of silence. The social worker, a seasoned woman, vomited twice during the visit. She cried silently on the way back. Her report was devastating, clinical, professional, and absolutely devastating. Ricardo returned to Chilpancingo with his thick folder full of duly requisitioned horrors. He felt strong. Now they had proof. Now they couldn't ignore him. Morales was gone. She had been transferred or promoted. In her place was a young man in an ill-fitting suit and a poorly tied tie. The young man read the report silently. He turned the pages slowly, with a concentration that seemed hopeful to Ricardo. Ricardo held his breath. Finally, the official looked up. There was no horror in his eyes, not even surprise. There was a kind of bureaucratic resignation, an inherited weariness. "Ah, yes," he said. "The Almontes." He opened a creaky metal filing cabinet. The sound was like a groan. He searched through old, dusty folders. He pulled one out, thick, yellowed. He blew the dust off the cover. File 345A Almonte family. Opened in 2008. Closed in 2010. Ricardo looked at him, confused. "What?" "Yes," said the young man without looking at him, leafing through the old file. There was already an attempt to intervene more than 15 years ago. A missionary reported them. And what happened? The official shrugged, a gesture that summed up the impotence of the system. The usual. A brigade was sent. The family refused to cooperate. They hid in the hills. The final report says, highly marginalized community, unreceptive to social programs, hostility toward intervention, case closed due to lack of conditions for follow-up. He tapped Ricardo's new folder with his finger. "Your report is more detailed, Doctor. Very good work." He took the folder. He opened it. He took a stamp out of his drawer. He inked it with exasperating slowness, and he stamped it on the first page of Ricardo's report. The sharp blow echoed in the silent office. The stamp read, "Attached to pre-existing file." Then, with a calmness that seemed monstrous to Ricardo, he put the new folder, the one with Ricardo's work, the one with the social worker's tears, inside the old, dusty folder. And he closed the filing cabinet drawer. The metallic, definitive sound was like a tombstone falling on a grave. "Thank you for your help, Doctor," said the young man, his attention already on another pile of papers on his desk. Ricardo didn't move. He was paralyzed, frozen, all his effort, the trip, the horror, the photos, the nausea, the sleepless nights, the social worker's tears. Everything had been absorbed by the system, swallowed up, and deposited in a metal coffin to rot alongside a decade-old report. It wasn't an investigation. It was a dead file. "But aren't you going to do anything?" Ricardo asked, his voice barely a broken whisper. The official looked up, irritated by the insistence. "Dr. Fuentes, this is a complex case. It involves customs and traditions, indigenous rights, as well as a clear rejection of state intervention. Legally, our hands are tied. If the community doesn't ask for help, we can't impose it. This has nothing to do with the law, it has to do with the children," Ricardo shouted, banging on the desk. "The children are part of that community," replied the official, his voice becoming cold and cutting. "And the law protects the autonomy of communities. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have 15 other files to process before lunchtime." It was the final blow, the system using its own rules to justify its inaction, turning protection into abandonment. The perfect cynicism. Ricardo left the DIF building. The Chilpancingo sun burned his face, but inside he felt freezing cold, the cold of absolute defeat. He hadn't fought a crazy matriarch on a mountain. He had fought something much bigger and more invincible. A 1,000-headed monster called bureaucracy. A system designed not to solve problems, but to perpetuate itself. A system where a closed file is a success, no matter the human tragedy it contains. He returned to his clinic in the mountains, but something in him had been broken forever. He no longer saw his patients with the same hope. He saw the flaws, the cracks through which people like the Almontes fell, and no one picked them up. A few months later, Angel Almonte's mother returned to the clinic, this time alone. She stood in front of his desk. "Angel died," she said. No tears, no emotion, as if she were reporting that the corn had run out. He had a bad cough. Then he got cold. Ricardo looked at her. He saw in her face the face of the matriarch, Soledad. He saw the face of Eulalia the first, the faces of generations of women who had accepted horror as their destiny, who had traded love for a blood pact, who had taught their daughters that the only safe refuge was the cage they themselves had built. The story of the Almonte women does not end, because it has never ended. Soledad is probably already dead. But another matriarch, trained in the same cruel law, will have taken her place. The pregnant teenager Ricardo saw will have given birth to a son who will also be his cousin. And that son, if he survives, will continue the cycle. The system did not return. The file remains in its metal tomb, gathering dust in Chilpancingo. The Almontes remain on their hill, protected by silence, condemned by their own blood, and forgotten by a world that prefers to fill out forms rather than face the truth. Evil does not always have horns and a trident. Sometimes it has the face of a bored civil servant, the sound of a rubber stamp, the silence of a file being closed. That is the real horror. Not the one who lives in the mountains, but the one who lives in air-conditioned offices, in government corridors, in the comfortable indifference of all of us. I am Mateo del Valle, and I'll see you in the next Realidad Prohibida.